Good afternoon. Good morning if you're coming to us from some other part of the country. My name is Colin Oriens. I am Director of the Environmental Studies Program at Tufts University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our weekly Hoch Cunningham Environmental Lecture Series. This series is made possible thanks to the generosity of Tufts alumni Daphne Hoch Cunningham and Roland Hoch. Each week when we present these series, we often provide announcements from the floor. So if you have an announcement you would like to make at some point in the future, we just request that you send us an email in advance and we can advertise your event. Would love to do that. If you want to receive alerts about the environmental lecture series each week, you can sign up for our newsletter, and we will put the newsletter link in the chat button. And if you are a student, you can also sign up to receive the student newsletter. And so you can get both a link to the fall schedule for the environmental lecture series and a link for signing up for the newsletter. So those will end up in the chats. I wanted to go over a little bit of the logistics of the talk before I introduce today's speaker. The chat is disactivated, so what we hope you will do is that you'll put your questions into the question and answer, and after Professor Cody's talk, we will try to get to as many of those questions as possible. The meeting will be recorded, so we can put those, we will post the recording onto our website, and you could watch it again later if you're so interested, or share it with others. So it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Kevin Cody today. He's our inaugural Hoch Cunningham Professor of the Practice in Food Systems, and he is a farmer training program manager at New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. He has a rich background. He's worked in Peru, he's worked in Colorado, he's now here in the Northeast, and his interest is really to think about, what are alternative food production methods? How do farmers get their product to market? And so he does a lot of farmer training, and in that training, he also trains them in the business of being a farmer, not just in how to grow. He's hoping to connect our students to the New Entry program. So if you're interested, I know he would love to hear from you in exploring ways that you could work with Dr. Cody. I should also add that he's currently teaching a course called Global Alternative Food Networks. It's a pretty exciting course and offers a new flavor of courses to Tufts University. He's doing a great job already at bridging the Arts and Sciences Environmental Studies program and the Friedman School of Nutrition. We're so excited to welcome him to Tufts. And today he's going to tell us a little bit about his work in this space. Welcome, Kevin. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Colin. Thanks for that introduction. Hello, everyone, and thanks for this opportunity to be here today to share sort of my journey up until this point, because the work I'll be talking about today encapsulates both some of my scholarly work and research, as well as my work as a practitioner in this space, focused on beginning farmers and alternative food movements. I want to share just a quick roadmap of where we're going to be going today, because I am, in one sense, moving between a couple of sort of disparate places and even potential farmer networks. So the first thing I want to do is provide us a little bit of context and how I'm thinking about this work from a global perspective and its relationship to an industrialized food system that, while remarkably productive, has disadvantaged certain small-scale farmers in unique ways. The alternative food movements I'll talk about are in one sense a response to some of those challenges posed by an agro-industrial and global food system. In that context too, I'll also briefly mention this concept of farmer viability, while also attempting to kind of raise some questions around what that means and what that means in different contexts. I'll move from there into a couple of case studies from Peru. Part of a research agenda I've had exploring international agricultural exchange program. And what this is starting to introduce this topic of what we might be able to learn and discover by putting some fairly distinct agricultural places and methods of production and historical and agrarian contexts into conversation with one another. And that component of this talk, I'm hoping will shine through as a real kind of key feature of what I hope we can take away from the lecture today. Those case studies in Peru also really emphasize this concept of organic. And I say concept because in these cases, it is more than a series of practices, although it's also that. So I'll talk about it in the context of a farmer's market in Peru and a community garden. From there, I'll take a pretty sharp turn in one sense and then think about New Entry Sustainable Farming Project and our work with beginning farmers in the United States. In addition to kind of presenting a little bit of background on beginning farmers in general, what some of those structural barriers are to those farmers, and then hopefully tie some of these pieces together in the very end that works towards an idea of a reflexive globalism, or thinking about some of these contexts and some of these practices and some of the discourse in a way that can unite some of these very distinct places. So as I mentioned, I wanted to start here with a look at productivity. Productivity as a measure of success in the ag and food space. By any measure, we have been tremendously successful and across these crops, and over time, we've been successful in the sense that yields have gone way up with more or less a similar land base, putting aside land that's being taken over for ranching, for example. So I want to start with this just to acknowledge that the industrial food system, which I'm sort of juxtaposing to some of the movements we'll be talking about, has been remarkably productive. Here's crop yields across the world from 1961 to 2018. And here's a graph just looking at crop yields in the United States, 1866 to 2014, focused on corn. And so, again, we can see some amazing productivity gains and this growth in productivity and in terms of yields. So a little tongue-in-cheek, but here's another graph. S&P 500 surpasses an all-time high just last week. So, oops. I put this in here just to acknowledge that sometimes those graphs reflecting growth, certainly they're not intended to tell the whole story. But what I want to suggest here is that there's a lot more going on and some hidden costs associated with that productivity and associated with that growth and yield of these various crops. Much like the S&P 500 is not telling the full story about the recession battering the US economy. So what are some of those costs? I'm not going to spend an enormous amount of time talking about this because I want to be able to focus more on some of the cases I'll mention today. But I like this graph. It tells a good sort of quick synopsis of some of the environmental impacts of food and agriculture across the globe. Whether we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions, land use, freshwater use, eutrophication, or biodiversity, and in this case, biodiversity occupation. Here's 94% of the mammals' biomass is made up of livestock. What this also isn't saying is that's displacing other kinds of biomass, and in very many instances, species that are on the verge of extinction, if not already having gone extinct. There are environmental tolls that food and agriculture represent. And there are also tolls to farmer livelihoods and the rural economies on which those farmer livelihoods have made possible. I'm going to say that these farmer livelihoods, and in some cases, in many cases, the rural economies that they're associated with, are imperiled by a global agri-food system. And how? Well, in a variety of ways, and this is not meant to be exclusive or an exhaustive, rather, list. Global trade is one example. You know, a statistic that gets floated around often is that 2 million farmers, corn farmers, were displaced as a result of trade policies enacted through NAFTA. The input requirements associated with making a living as a farmer, as more and more farmers begin to adopt practices associated with a conventional or industrial food system, those often require certain kinds of inputs, whether that's technology, machinery, synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, things like that. And I think one example of the toll those input requirements are taking is you look at the debt burden and farmer suicides in India as one example of a result of what it means to be adopting to these new kinds of practices. And I'll tell a story about farmer inputs and kind of adoption of conventional alternative or industrial practices in one of my cases. Land access continues to be an issue facing farmers around the world. It's a particularly resonant one here with the work that we're doing with new and beginning farmers. And this concept or this phrase of get big or get out has applied to agriculture for a long time, as it does other sort of industries in a capitalist system. And there are some ways in which I think agriculture remains unique, distinct. We won't get into those here, but I think in other ways it very much is a part of a system whereby if a farmer cannot or chooses not to scale up their operation, they're often squeezed out of production, threatening livelihoods and everything else upon which those livelihoods might depend. So I'm also going to make a case here too that agroecological, regenerative, sustainable, and peasant farmers are themselves drivers of agrarian change. This is not just my argument. Others have made it and made it much more effectively than I will today. But I say that to acknowledge that the livelihoods of small-scale farmers, because it's important to make that differentiation as well, that the farmers I'm referring to here are typically smaller scale family farms. And I think we won't get into too many of the details around that, but I think there is a differentiation that I want to make because painting all farmers with the same type of brush is probably an injustice. So that said, the farmers that I want to focus on here do tend to be smaller scales, peasant family farmers that really are a backbone of many of the rural economies, and that's not just, you know, in developing countries around the world where the share of farming as a representative of GDP is much greater than it is in industrialized countries like the US. These farmers also have a role to play in environmental stewardship. We recognize that there's a lot of environmental costs associated with industrial agriculture, and I think there's a growing understanding that farmers, in particular kinds of farmers, are going to be one of the most important social actors in helping change some of the environmental practices and devastation caused by industrial agriculture. These are farmers that are often growing in ways that are associated with particular cultural traditions and crops. And as the industrial food system becomes less diverse and, you know, processed foods more commonplace around the world, we stand to lose some of those traditions and some of those traditional crops. The resilient food supply piece is something I think is also distinct and important to acknowledge in this particular context we're living through as we see supply chains start to be disrupted as a result of the global pandemic, and just acknowledging that a more and greater diversity of farmers as a base of a local and regional food system adds resiliency to that food supply. And this is across the global north and south. And this is one of the challenges I think I've undertaken for today, is to really try to draw some connections across what are ostensibly very distinct and different agrarian context. Agrarian social movements is another way that I'll just segue into that now. That these farmers constitute, in some cases, one of the most diverse and sort of largest agrarian movements around the world. La Via Campesina is one primary example of that. And this is both a form of resistance, I would argue, to the agro-industrialization, and a way of promoting a connection or a relationship to food, to farmers, and to place, and to the places that make those foods and farmers distinct. I've added a couple of extra images here. One is a Buy Fresh, Buy Local campaign out of Cape Cod, and this other one from American Farmland Trust that's really focused on improving access and maintaining, preserving farmland. This concept, no farms, no food. It's arguable and debatable whether or not buy local and a no farms, no food constitute the type of movement that I'm conceiving of here as an alternative food movement. And I think it's worthy to consider how these market-based mechanisms like a Buy Fresh, Buy Local, for example, do they constitute a movement in a traditional or even a non-traditional sense? I'm putting them together here because I feel like on a large scale, these are initiatives and measures that are doing all of these things, right? They're resisting agro-industrialization and promoting a connection to food, farmers, and to place, and maybe doing so in some distinctive ways, and maybe the opportunity to strengthen them as a coherent movement is one thing that we can think about at the end of this talk. So in this talk, first, I want to talk a little bit about farm viability, what this even means. In one sense, farm viability equals success. But then what do we even mean by success? In a beginning farmer space, we talk about this sometimes as a result of our program outcomes. What do we want to see happen? A lot of the funding for beginning farmer training success means new farm businesses. And I want to think through how we might expand that notion of success. And does a business mean that it's a sole proprietor who's making their living primarily off the land? What if it's supplemental, right? Can a small supplemental income still constitute success for a beginning farmer in this case? And I'm going to argue that it does, and that there are maybe other ways to consider success that go beyond an economic framework. So in this talk, I will, again, explore this concept of farmer viability across some distinct agrarian contexts, specifically Peru, and then I'll look at the case of new entry here in Massachusetts. In doing so, I'm hoping that we can expand this geographic frame of reference for alternative food movements that are sometimes conceptualized purely within the realm of movements that are primarily coming out of a global South context, whether that's peasant-led movements or focus on indigenous farming practices through something like agroecology. But that putting these into conversation across a broader geographic frame of reference could lead to some really productive possibilities for, I think, addressing and improving farmer viability. And then to those ends, I'm thinking what we could do is work towards this concept of a reflexive globalism, or a reflexive understanding of movement, discourse, and practice in this global context. I'm borrowing this term reflexive in a fairly specific way from a concept of reflexive localism that really interrogates a concept of local agriculture, what local means, what it doesn't, and what an unreflexive look at local food means, is putting blinders on to a lot of these important sort of social historical contexts in which something like local food, for example, gets discussed and enacted. In a global context, I think we have maybe more work cut out for us, but I think this notion of reflexivity, especially in the way I'm talking about global context here, is a really important one. And we'll get into what that might mean at the very end. So hopefully I still have your attention, because now at this point we're gonna move into some of the case studies. Two cases in particular to start with from Peru. As I mentioned, organic features heavily in both of these, but in some fairly distinct ways. One, we'll be looking at an organic farmers market in Lima, Peru, and another community garden in the northern part of Peru in a community called Lamud near Chachapoyas. So some important context for thinking about these case studies is that there are individuals featured in both that participated in an organization called the Multinational Exchange for Sustainable Agriculture. Their participation meant that they spent almost a full year working and living on an organic farm, or in one case, a dairy, in different host farms throughout the United States that basically host international apprentices, primarily from, when I was doing research with them, from Peru and Ecuador, but participants, they called them stewards, also came from Thailand, Ghana, Sri Lanka, places throughout primarily developing country contexts, who then came to the United States for an apprenticeship, effectively, what's now being called a certificate in applied agroecology, to really learn about practices that they might be able to then bring back, translate, adopt to their home country context. So it's important to mention because I think it does set the stage for some of this work, and certainly for the research that I've done in these places. So starting with the Bioferia, this is in Miraflores, a relatively upscale part of Lima. And I did work mostly with a cheese producer for their business called Vacas Felices, Happy Cows. The market itself is unique, I would argue, in the context of Peru, although there are other sort of bioferias throughout Lima and other parts of the country. This is probably still the most recognizable, the most productive. It's been around for almost 20 years. Last count, there were about 40 small farmers and food producers growing, in this case, a certified organic product for this particular market. And you can see that the market resembles in many ways markets that we might see in the United States. There are vendors selling and promoting their eggs and their eggs as cage-free, their milk as pasture-raised, and food as organic. All of the qualities and the values, right, that we sometimes associate with markets and producers in the United States, which is one of the things I got interested in here. I'll also mention that certified organic produce is an important part of this. Organic agriculture has a major plays a major role in agriculture in Peru, but primarily for export markets. And so what makes this market and some of the producers distinct is that they're growing predominantly for a domestic market in a certified organic produce. Vacas Felices got their start, gosh, probably over 10 years ago now. And when they started, they were getting milk from a whole series of farmers in a community that they had connections to a few hours outside of Lima. And they got to spend some time there in their cheese making operation that they've since moved into town, into the city, and was struck by, on one hand, the similarities that appeared in this farmer's market. I, at the time, was living in Santa Cruz, California, and the markets were remarkably similar in so many ways. And then I went up to the mountains and got to spend some time with them where they were making cheese and getting milk from local farmers. Milk that was often coming in this case on a donkey, and in other cases carried in 2-liter bottles, that were well used. So here we see some of these really important distinctions start to emerge in what appears to be a similar type of market environment. And that's one of the things that struck me about this place then too, is that the market, while it has all the trappings of a market that we might be familiar with here, there is a kind of entrepreneurialism reflected in the Vacas Felices organization that's linked to rural development in a way that we're not necessarily seeing in the United States to that same extent. There's also a revalorization of farming by this emphasis on organic agriculture or ecological agriculture. In Peru, that word ecológico is used for organic, which I think is important in some ways. So we see through this market a growing movement of revalorizing a type of farming and farmer throughout the country that's starting to spread into some other markets and market opportunities. At the same time, this market does still reflect some of the exclusionary market forces that we see with similar markets in the United States, right? And that relates to who gets to access these markets, both in terms of their geography and the cost associated with buying a product it's arguably more expensive than others that they could get in the nearby areas. There's a class distinction for who goes to this market. It's not just sort of tourists such as myself at one point, but also sort of relatively wealthy or affluent consumers in a particular part of town. And there's also this idea of distinction, right? Where you're suddenly, by certifying organic product distinct, you're calling it something that has a certain price premium associated with it, even though the default for many of the sort of small producers around the country is effectively organic. But this distinction now sort of raises some of those problematics in addition to some of those market opportunities. So the second case I'm going to mention is an organic community garden, or biohuerto ecológico. And this is a case of a particular individual named Maria and the work that she did after she returned from the United States with the Club de Madres. And this is in northern Peru. A little about the agrarian context here. This is an area that's growing predominantly food for subsistence production, corn, beans, some squash, some grains, and potatoes. Although interestingly, what we were seeing and what I started to see, and it's important for this case study, is that organic became salient concept because there was suddenly, over the past 10 and 20 years, and this is 10, 30 years ago, or generation essentially, there was an increasing adoption of conventional potatoes and a use of fertilizers and pesticides to grow them, which, as we can see, has raised some issues in that community. The garden then emerges as a sort of counterpoint to this kind of influx of use of chemicals and fertilizers. Community garden participants are again part of this Club de Madres. They're using produce from the garden in their home and in a nearby school. There's formal instruction happening in this garden setting provided by Maria about biointensive agriculture, which is what she learned in the United States. And I want to just mention a few quotes here from participants on this concept of organic. The vegetables without fertilizer, which are pure, without chemicals, are the only kind we're interested in producing. For me, it's important to know how this plant is grown, if this plant has chemicals or not. And as I mentioned, with regards to potatoes in the market, the shifting agrarian dynamics in the hills around town, where there's predominantly subsistence production taking place. We buy potatoes in the market. We grow squash, corn. The potatoes are grown by people with money because they have to buy fertilizer. And it takes a lot of people to plant and harvest. That picture I had earlier, the group of individuals harvesting, in our case, corn, was a practice that was relatively common in the countryside, where you basically get together your entire family and everyone and some extended family to bring in a harvest. Well, as potatoes became increasingly common and the scale of production also started to grow, because in order to make money with the amount of money you're spending on inputs, you had to put more land in production. Again, for potatoes, it displaced that communal labor and started requiring labor as an input to purchase. Before the community garden, everything was from the market because no one had any experience. We had no organization. But now we have our garden organization, so we had food for the school cafeteria and for our own home. These quotes, I think, are illustrative of the way in which many of the women from this Club de Madres expressed their thoughts about organic and the value of this particular garden. And I mentioned the potatoes in the fields above town because I feel like that was a really important factor influencing a way of thinking about organic, was by juxtaposing it to a relatively new conventional method of production. And all the potatoes that were grown with these fertilizers are for export. They're not consumed by the community. All right, here's the hard pivot. So now we're leaving Peru and we're coming to our backyard in Beverly, Massachusetts, where I want to talk a little bit about new and beginning farmers in the United States as it relates to these concepts of farm viability and alternative food movements. A little bit of context for US beginning farmers. This is information that shows the number of beginning farmers by the year on their current operation, according to USDA census data from 2007, 12, and 17. So what we see, a 12% decline in the total number of beginning farmers in that 10-year period, more entering in the 2-year time period. Then if you look at 5 to 9 years on their current operation, there's a 25% decline between 2007 and 17. And for folks working in this space, this is a significant number because what it shows to us is something that we know anecdotally from the field. Around year 5, farmers begin to hit a wall. And there need to be additional support structures in place to get those businesses through that 5 to 9 year window in order to be successful over the long term, if in fact that's their goal. So again, just to show that there are some challenges facing beginning farmers, especially as they enter years 5 through 9 on their operation. Another just small piece of context here, this is from a different data set from the Ag Marketing Service, USDA. The percent of farms, of beginning farms are making less than $10,000 is about over 2/3. So over 2/3 of beginning farmers in this data set from 2013 to 17 are making less than $10,000. If we look at the percent value of production, then that 2/3 are accounting for about 2% of the value of production. While if you look on the other end, if you're making over $100 million, those farmers are accounting for almost 50% of those beginning farmers. So these are just small snapshots in a larger story, but I do want to kind of raise them here because I think it starts to paint an interesting picture. New Entry Sustainable Farming Project, a program of the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy, has been working to promote new and beginning farmers and their livelihoods for over 20 years. This is an overwhelming graphic, but I just want to point out in the center here the programs that we offer to help do that. Whether it's an Explore Farming workshop, we teach crop production workshops over the summer, business planning courses over the fall and winter, and we run a farm incubator, which I'll talk a little bit more about in addition to helping folks access land after they transition off that incubator, each with their own series of objectives and potential impacts. A couple of images from our farm, from one of our incubator plots, from one of our own demonstration plots where we teach a lot of the materials to farmers and to folks in our crop production course. And a group of amazing sort of volunteers and staff here, and Jeremy from the Friedman School, who was helping out with our course and farm all summer long. So just to give you a quick snapshot too of these farmers at new entry, these are new and beginning farmers. We have 11 unique farm businesses being incubated on the farm right now. Each of them gets access to 1/4 to a full acre of land for up to 3 years. And that includes access to equipment, infrastructure, markets, and technical assistance. So despite this work, and I know I went through it quite quickly, but hopefully it gave you at least a snapshot of kind of where some beginning farmers are at, what some of the challenges they might face, what some of the work being done. There are still enormous sort of structural barriers facing these individuals. And this despite relatively large, well, I guess it's arguable, investment anyway, from the USDA Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program, anywhere from $15 to $25 million a year, and is a grant program to support organizations like ours that do beginning farmer training. That training and technical assistance usually focused on what's sometimes called a sort of knowledge deficit approach, providing information, training, and technical assistance in business planning, crop planning. And yet, it's still a challenge for a variety of reasons, and I think not least of which is because the historical agrarian context in the United States has made it such that not everyone gets to access the training programs that sometimes are provided. So there's issues of privilege and access, not just for the training programs, but for land and for the entry points into farming are constrained by some of the social historical forces that have shaped agriculture in this country, including issues related to justice and equity. Access to land, to markets, capital, to labor. These are all forces that continue to sort of impede the ability of new and beginning farmers to grow their operations and to maybe get past that initial few years where their viability is predicated on, in some cases, the exploitation of their own labor. They're not paying themselves. They're able to grow food and to supply food for their community, but rarely, if sometimes ever, to be able to sort of reinvest money in that operation sufficient to get them to the point where they can buy land, buy equipment. There's a variety of programs out there that we don't have time to discuss that are trying to address some of these barriers. One of the things that I'm going to argue here as we wrap up is that not only should we be encouraging folks to continue to participate in some of those programs to support new and beginning farmers, but that we might also start looking outward to how other movements around the globe are conceiving their work regards to peasant small family farms and farm viability, to learn from those movements as a way of supporting farmers here in the United States. And this is happening already, and I think it can be happening in perhaps some new and important ways. Beginning farmers that I'm talking about are in so many ways distinct from peasant farmers, subsistence farmers in Peru. And yet, I do think that there are these opportunities to promote global solidarity and agricultural exchange that can break down some of those barriers and let folks know that we are operating in a similar place, in some cases against similar sort of market dynamics. This notion of reflexivity, it includes an acknowledgement of, for example, right, the privilege, the racism, justice issues, and the history built into some of these agrarian contexts. Land reform in Peru looks very different than land reform in the United States. And yet, I wonder if there are still some opportunities to think about land reform from a broader perspective now by learning from what's happening around the world. One example is thinking about how food sovereignty in the United States might expand what a social movement scholar Tilly calls the repertoires of contention. What are the tools in our tool belt to help address new and beginning farmer viability? And I think the more we can include a social movement dimension to the work that's being done, we would move beyond a knowledge deficit approach, which merely tries to provide skills and knowledge which are necessary but maybe not sufficient to ensure the long-term viability of new farmers on the land. The last thing I'll say here too is that I think it's important we really consider what viability and success means in both these new and beginning farmer contexts and maybe more broadly. With the case of Maria in the community garden, for example, farm viability might pertain to their ability to continue to farm in that garden space, which means they have to have a stronger relationship with the city that's allotted them that space to grow, and to build those relationships that allow them access to that land and the relationships with the school where a lot of the produce was being distributed. So viability isn't just in that case the ability to make money off of the operation. And I think the same can be true for, in some cases, beginning farmers, for whom, most of whom have outside occupations, right? That, I think 43% of beginning farmers, for example, the farmer and the potential partner on that farm work off-site, which is not uncommon. So again, is viability making your entire livelihood off the operation? Is it a subsistence-based approach? Maybe $10,000 a year actually has a significant impact for you and your family to where that could be considered a success. And so I think both sort of in these economic terms and in broader conceptualizations about what it means to be viable in this space, it means to be able to continue to do what you do to fulfill your own objectives and to serve perhaps some of these broader alternative food movement goals to create a more sustainable food system. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I really enjoyed that. We have one question in the question Q&A, but I want to just ask a quick one from my own experience working with those who teach agroecology or coffee farmers in Costa Rica. A lot of times we as scientists think the major barrier is environmental, and my colleague said their major issue is getting their kids to want to farm. And so issues of how do you keep the farm going. And so it strikes me that what you're talking about in terms of training new farmers becomes all the more imperative as you think about transitions of ownership of farms. And I was wondering if you could reflect on that based on what you saw in Peru or what you're trying to do here in New Entry.
Yeah, thanks. It's another really great parallel, right? Is the exodus from farming, for good reason, that we're seeing both in the United States and in a developing country context, like the places I was in Peru. They also, in some cases, we're seeing a sort of rural to urban migration, right? Is a continual trend. And I think that many of the farmers I talked to felt like they weren't able to sort of get their kids interested into a point, or get their sort of offspring interested to take over an operation. Folks were going into Lima and going to the city looking for more opportunity. So I think providing economic opportunity in rural environments through agriculture as a livelihood strategy is a really important way to think about development that pertains to both of these kind of very different contexts in both Peru and the United States. But again, I think that's all predicated on the fact that there is a sort of economic viability built into that system as well.
Great. Harshad Vaswani has a two-part question. You could probably read this as well in the Q&A. Is the volume of production from alternative food systems and small-scale farms adequate to compensate for the demand from urban centers? And the second part of that question was, are you aware of incentives being offered by the US government to individuals to adopt agriculture as a profession over urban career options?
Yeah, so the first question I think is a critical one, right? What often is discussed in the literature around advocating for small scale and peasant agriculture is that the productive capacity of that farming sector, if we can call it that, is sufficient to meet the demand, but that the structures that prioritize the type of industrial food system we have right now, there's simply the access points aren't there, right? The supply chain linkages aren't there. Some of the work that we're doing at New Entry, for example, is to aggregate produce from many small farms in order to access some of these larger institutional markets. So it's a small example of a way that these farmers, through the proper sort of supply chain and organization, could potentially feed those urban centers. But I think if you're asking me in another way too, the answer is it's a yes and approach, right? That we absolutely need still, we're not going to shift on a dime tomorrow, the type and the volume of produce that comes out of an industrialized food system. Absolutely. Still, how do we find ways to also create space, economically and otherwise, for a different kind of farming sector that has other attributable benefits, both environmental, social, and economic? As for like the US programs to serve, to get farmers interested, yes, I think in short, the USDA has a variety of sort of programs, incentives to help support new and beginning farmers, both in terms of training, grants, loans. I still think that there may be a little bit sort of disorganized, and that a stronger sort of movement approach across the sector could help sort of solidify some of those opportunities in a way that resonates more with young people who are interested in farming, beyond the kind of bureaucratic or technocentric focus that the USDA brings.
There's a couple questions that are social. Before I go to those, there's one more question sort of about scale. Is there a limit to the scale of these alternative farming practices, or what point does a farm change from sustainable to industrial? Or is there an industrial sustainable agriculture?
Yeah, that's also a provocative and I think a good question. And I would say, and maybe this is a cop-out, but there is a spectrum, right? Both in terms of the sustainability of an industrial enterprise, right? It could be reducing its dependency or application of certain pesticides based on precision agriculture, precision technologies. That scales back the potential damage to, waterways and eutrophication. That said, I think the other sort of part of that question maybe was that, how we might scale up some of these alternative food movement practices. And I think, again, there are some strategies that are approaching that. And I think we're seeing some really fascinating things take place with regards to like agroforestry and the ability to sort of integrate diverse cropping systems in a way that's both scalable and addresses some of the environmental sort of impact concerns, or really adds benefit to a system. I think that the issue of scale, however, is one that's been discussed for a long time with regards to agroecology and alternative methods of production. That's still in practice kind of remains to be seen. I think there's a lot of understanding that in theory it's possible, but in practice, I think the scalability piece is still a real sort of challenge to being able to kind of more, without caveat, advocate for this type of production and its benefits.
Thank you. So I'm going to pivot a little bit. Farmers are some of the hardest working people you ever meet. And Kathy Stanton writes, given how busy and stressed both farmers and people in the agrarian advocacy groups are, and farmers are, what kind of actors and organizations can best create and nurture these emerging spaces of global solidarity?
I love that question. I love it because it's both tricky and it's one that I continue to grapple with and that we grapple with at New Entry. New Entry, like many nonprofits or nonprofit-like organizations, tries to be all things to all people in the space. And what we continue to recognize is that we, can't do that and probably shouldn't do that. And so, if we're not the ones advocating for land access, who is? There was an article recently that came out around New Entry farmers that really advocates for what they call sort of wraparound services, where you could link a beginning farmer training program with a land access program, with a policy-based organization that's advocating for these things at the state-based level. That doesn't necessarily address your question, though, which is sort of who's doing the linkages, right? How are those services being put together in a regional sense, much less in a global sense? But I think that there are some really great organizations that have adopted things like food sovereignty for US frameworks and agroecology in the United States context, places where they didn't necessarily originate, that are starting to build some of those bridges. And so an emphasis on global and solidarity, agroecology commons comes up as a place to maybe sort of start those answering those questions.
So there's, I'm going to try, I think I'm going to hop around here. So Jessica Brennan writes, I'm wondering if we know how often beginner farmers, if successful, transition into industrial farming, as opposed to retaining alternative environmentally sustainable practices. Put it another way, when beginning farmers become established farmers, do they still embody alternative food movements, or do they become part of the industrial agricultural complex?
I think what's more common maybe is that beginning farmers aren't just emerging from an alternative space, for lack of a better word. That many beginning farmers are still emerging from sort of arguably within an industrial or semi-industrialized systems. And so, for example, in the data set I showed around beginning farmers, only a small few of them making over $100,000, those are farmers generally focused on ranch cattle operations and large-scale grain operations. And that same USDA Ag Marketing Service report mentioned what to me was a sort of striking statistic, that the majority of beginning farmers in their data set were actually involved in cattle production and industrialized grains, which isn't aligned so much with my experience or a lot of others in the space, where beginning farmers are mostly involved in specialty crops at a relatively small scale. Specialty crops meaning fruits and vegetables. So I don't know if many specialty crop growers who are doing fruits and vegetables as beginning farmers would transition into doing it sort of at a much larger scale. But I think certainly scaling up, right, to a point is something that we see happening, but we don't see a lot sort of pivoting into what I might sort of say a heavily sort of capitalized and sort of heavy technology driven operation, let's say over hundreds of acres growing a single monocrop, for example. Don't see that happening a lot, but do see beginning farmers emerging from both spaces.
So this next question, I think, ties into something you kind of winked at earlier, which is knowledge deficit approach is the sort of the model. And I think you were not quite comfortable with that language and the way you presented it. And so what else would be part of a farmer training that isn't using a knowledge deficit approach, is the question from Kayla Worley.
Yeah, thanks, Kayla. It's a good question, and I think that there are folks just starting to consider this now in the beginning farmer training space, is that the sort of techno-scientific or knowledge deficit approach is a particular sort of pedagogy in one sense, that sort of bringing knowledge to somebody who needs it and giving it to them and then saying good luck, doesn't take into account what that person does with that knowledge or how they might access resources to implement the knowledge that they've received, right? So putting the sort of pedagogical piece and its problematics aside, it still doesn't address some of those structural forces beyond the farm gate. And are there organizations that are doing well? I think that there are some that have a policy orientation. I know New Entry at least thinks about these things often, and we try to connect folks to other organizations that can, for example, refer back to other organizations to help things like land access, right? So our emphasis on land access has kind of waxed and waned over the years. We still recognize that it's a critically important piece, but that maybe others are better suited to be able to kind of actually make the linkage between a farmer and new land. I think there are still some greater opportunities, underexplored opportunities, to go beyond a knowledge deficit approach, which one could be an integrative approach, looking at sort of a variety of services where a single entity has reached out to a variety of organizations like New Entry and others and pulled them together into a certain place, including sort of the policy piece, which implies a sort of political engagement. And I think that's the other kind of piece that might be lacking to an extent. There is advocacy happening at the state level and in the federal level to get funds, for example, to train beginning farmers. But if those funds are training beginning farmers in the same ways, what policy actions might we be taking that think more broadly about how we could organize as a social movement might to advocate for broader systemic land reform, to addressing some of the histories of injustice and racism that have excluded people from participating in the space to begin with. And I see there being some momentum right now to kind of build up a movement such as that, whether or not it's going to be a single organization or a multitude, probably the latter. And so let's see what happens.
So this will be the last question. So Allison Lee, what is the role of consumers in the alternative food movement and the farm viability? In some ways, she goes on to talk about buy local and farm to table. It's really a consumer driven, I might call it top down, depending on your perspective, and trying to get consumers to change their habits to support these farmers. Are these the types of initiatives enough to sustain and nourish alternative food systems?
The short answer maybe is necessary, but not sufficient in my mind. In that there requires to be much more than this market-driven mechanism predicated on having access to certain consumers with the knowledge and maybe awareness, but awareness does not equal access in this environment. Being aware of quality food does not mean you get to access that food, whether or not you have the money to do it or are in a geographic location in order to do that either. So I think that there remains a need to be organizing at some of these broader levels to advocate for agrarian reform and land access in our urban and rural environments, and to really think more broadly than what the market mechanism itself has to offer. I don't want to discount the significance there, but I think we need to and ought to perhaps take a broader sort of social movement lens when thinking about how best to advocate for a new kinds of food system and new kinds of farmers to be viable in this space.
Thank you very much. I'd love if we could all give a round of applause. And at that, we'll conclude today's presentation. I'm going to sort of stop the recording. If someone wants to still write some